Now, the Justice, Police and Health Department have gathered to address the corruption allegations levelled against the State Attorney's Office. Let's now cross over live to those proceedings.
CEO of Legal Aid South Africa as project manager, a review of the policy and legislative framework governing the state legal services, particularly the role of the Office of the State Attorney and other legal services in government. This is intended to develop a new comprehensive and more effective system of provision of state legal services at all three spheres of government so as to enhance its efficiency, effectiveness, and professionalism. This, in part, is in response to the shortcoming I have already identified earlier, as well as findings and recommendations of the report of the Public Service Commission and by other stakeholders regarding the functionality and performance of the Office of the State Attorney. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minister. Minister Motsoaledi, do you want to?
No, I'll answer questions.
You'll answer questions. Minister Cele, same. Thanks. Let's immediately go to your questions. You will identify yourself, introduce yourself and the institution from which you come, and let's if possible, avoid a string of questions at once. Are there any takers? I see a hand here. It being Women's Month, shall we start with that? Thanks.
Thank you so much for being forthright with the problems facing the Office of the State Attorney. The question I have for the head of the SIU is, what is the timelines for this investigation? Who's heading this team? And how big is the team investigating it? How big is the investigation in general? General Cele, you haven't really commented so far as to how this has affected you. We've heard from Minister Motsoaledi in the Sunday Times. Is there anything that you picked up with regards to the Ministry of Police that you're being sued?
Can you speak to the mic?
All right. So Minister Cele, if you could just perhaps give me an indication as to, how widespread and how affected you are in the Ministry of Police. And then Minister Masutha, also just a timeline on when is this overhaul or this review of the state litigation services, when is that likely to be concluded? Thank you.
Thanks. Let's take the gentleman there.
Good morning, Ministers. Barry Bateman, Eyewitness News. Could you just comment or provide additional details related to this figure of 80 billion rand that we saw in weekend reports, that is an estimated amount that has been defrauded from the state so far? Could you give me an idea of how did we reach that figure, if that figure is indeed accurate? And then could you touch on the modus operandi of these individuals, the collusion between private state or private law firms and the State Attorney's Office, how they managed to get that money out of the state? Thank you.
Ministers, if you don't mind, shall I check with Cape Town if they have a question? So that we just do a... Cape Town, do you have a question?
Yes, we do.
Please go ahead.
Tamar Khan from Business Day. My first question is to the Minister of Health. Minister, could you please provide us with an update on the scale of the medico-legal claims facing the state? The last published figure, I think, was for the end of March last year. Do you have an update on that? What's the scale of the problem that you confront? And can you, I'm not sure if this is a question to the Minister of Justice, could you please provide some specifics? How many cases are being investigated? Which are the private law firms that are implicated in this? How many people, lawyers, some specifics, cases and law firms, please.
Thanks. Over to you, ministers.
Do you want to start, SIU?
Okay. Okay. No, thank you very much, ministers, program director, and members of the media. The question directed to me was around the timelines of the investigation and how big is the team that will do the investigation. As you are aware, that the proclamation has been recently gazetted after being signed off by the President. The process that we do follow afterwards in kicking off the investigations formally is obviously that we put together the team, and the team does a further assessment of the allegations and the scope, further assessment of the scope and the focus areas. In this case, focus areas would probably be, the offices that are to be prioritized, the offices of the state attorney, and the areas within their business processes that we focus at, be it settlements, be it default judgments, be it any other process based on the allegations that we have received. So, in terms of the timelines, we are anticipating that this investigation is going to cover, in fact, across the country, all the offices of the state attorney in the 9 provinces, based on the allegations that we have received. So you'll understand that it's quite complex. So we are giving the investigation team not more than 12 months, but in the event that there are allegations that we keep on receiving, we will obviously not turn a blind eye on those. We will continue to investigate, but so that we show finality on those allegations that we have received earlier, we will then issue an interim report to the President with clear outcomes and clear actions that needs to be taken against any of the identified, shall I say, individuals or firms of attorneys. How big is the team? At the moment, we've put together a team, a multi-skilled team. That team consists of the members that have pure investigative skills, forensic investigative skills, that is. We've got the members that are lawyers, and I have emphasized to the team that because we are dealing with an attorney's firm or investigation into the attorney's office, we do have employed within SIU those members who are admitted attorneys, so we'd have to have the team being beefed up by those members who understand the attorney's office business, so that from end to end, we have to map first what is the business process that is followed by the state attorney's office. Obviously, we'll have to engage with the state attorney's office themselves to understand if there are any standard operating procedures, what is the law applicable to their processes, so that we can engage and be able to investigate where is it that there is a presence of maladministration or malpractice or any other infraction of the law that we may come across. We do also employ members of the team who are chartered accountants, because in the process there might be a need to quantify some of the numbers that we need to quantify. Already there's a question from the floor in terms of how is it that we have quantified some of the numbers. So it is important that we get the skills within the team that is able to then quantify the numbers that will come across. So the actual number of the team members we'll probably finalize it in the next week or two. But in the process, we are continuing just with the scoping and engaging the appropriate offices, just so that we do not waste time. those are the questions that really were directed at me, Program Director. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Seeing that I have this non-paid job of moving the mics, can I ask Minister Motsoaledi to, in that order, to be the next...
I thought we were avoiding to move them, but we're still doing so.
No. It's no. I'm saying in a particular order.
Okay. Yes. Please. Yes. Thank you very much. The question directed to me is, what is the scale of the claim against the Department of Health now? We collate these figures at the end of the financial year. So the figures I'm going to quote are for the last financial year. They are not, we did not incorporate anything for this year. So at the end of that, it was 56 billion, 960 million, 200,088 rand. This is not the money that has been defrauded or paid. It's what has been claimed. In other words, when you calculate the total number of claims, if the state was to pay them today, all of them, assuming that they are all correct, legal and legitimate, then the state will pay 56 billion, 960 million, 200,088 rand. Thank you.
Just to amplify on the timelines question, to indicate that you'd notice that in the statement we also allude to the fact that where appropriate, other corrective measures would be taken, including criminal investigations, leading to prosecutions, as well as disciplinary action against affected officials. So it's going to be a multi-pronged effort. But over and above that, it may well be necessary for us to, for example, use tools such as extradition and mutual legal assistance where it is necessary to go beyond our borders. As you are aware, we are responsible for generally for securing those kind of cooperation initiatives with other countries where that becomes necessary. So depending on what the preliminary investigations direct us to, we will go wherever. When you do spring cleaning, you don't leave certain corners and nooks because that may well just be where the cockroaches are hiding. So you make sure that wherever the broom, wherever the feather duster, wherever the mob takes you, you go there. So it would be difficult, as the SIU head, Advocate Mothibe, has indicated at this stage, to be, definitive about how long it will take. I think we will allow the process to unfold, see the preliminary reports where they lead us, and judging from the scale, enormity, and complexity of the issue and the various interventions that will need to be taken, that would give us a better picture. The issue also of the ballpark figure. You see, the claims, for example, the 56 billion that Minister Motsoaledi has alluded to, may not necessarily all be accounted for as fraud and corruption per se. So the investigation is intended to establish that fact as to how much of that amounts to undue and unlawful claims made against the state. And as you know, the role of the SIU is to recover losses incurred by the state. So the investigation would be to establish that fact in order to determine which of these monies were due or are due to the state and should be recovered. Now, you'd recall that, and the very reason why we've invited the Minister of Police to join us as well, apart from his interest in ensuring that where criminality is uncovered, that he and the police play the role of investigation of possible criminality. The police themselves appear to have been a victim of this systematic fleecing of the state coffers. And therefore they are a significant interested party, maybe not at the with the same enormity in terms of quantum as that of the Department of Health. And it's not necessarily confined to the two departments, we believe, but we think that they are the bigger victims in the scale of things. So basically, in addition to the 56 billion that health alone has incurred, you then have police and other departments. My own departments have been victims as well. We have had instances where at corrections, settlements are made in circumstances where, we have difficulty or matters are allowed to lapse and for the state to lose cases, and you don't know who gets to benefit. So it's a wide-ranging investigation which does not necessarily confine itself to pure financial loss, which is the primary focus, but where there are other forms of losses, those would be pursued and appropriate remedial action taken. The issue of how many investigators, he's answered that, but how many lawyers or law firms?
Well, we're going to come out of those live proceedings of a press briefing held by Justice Minister Michael Masutha alongside the Police Minister, Bheki, as well as the Health Minister, Dr. Motsoaledi. They're currently unpacking more details with regards to the many allegations of corruptions which have been levelled against the State Attorney's Office. We do know now that the ministers are currently fielding questions from the gathered media houses at that briefing. And our Minister of Women in the Presidency, Bathabile Dlamini, will deliver a keynote address at a seminar on landless women of South Africa. The seminar will take place in Pretoria, Durban and in Cape Town. It has been organized by the Human Sciences Research Council and seeks to add women's voices in the debate on land expropriation without compensation. One of the key objectives of this is to engage on the lack of property rights and how it has contributed to the exclusion of women from economic participation. Let's now cross over live to those proceedings.
Are involved in the agricultural sector in one way or the other. This highlights the importance of developing proper policies and programs that address their needs, their interests, and the value add of women to the food security issue that we are facing in the world today. Less than 20% of the world's landowners are women. Women represent fewer than 5% of all agricultural landowners in North Africa and West Asia, while in sub-Saharan Africa it's a little bit better. Women own 13% of the land that they work on. Research indicates that where more income is put in the hands of women, child nutrition, health, and education improves. In South and Central America, rural children are about 1.8 times more likely to be underweight than their urban counterparts. Other regions do not fare much better, as in South Africa. So you can see where the problem lies here. And I think that we are not talking enough about this. And it's not only about rural women, it's not only about agriculture, but I think we all know about the problem of intersectionality in South Africa, the triple scourge of racism, of sexism, and of the problem of class. So the face of poverty in South Africa is still predominantly the women, and in particular, rural women. This is unfortunate, as we have many strong female leaders in South Africa. So we need to start to probe where the problems really lie and how we can deal with them, because clearly, I've just told you there are problems. So before I go further, I'll share my legal view a little bit on Section 25. The Bill of Rights in the South African Constitution is a transformative document. It is not a static document at all. And that is why courts can interpret and lawyers can interpret the Constitution. The most important part of the Constitution is the preamble to the Constitution. The whole Constitution must be read within the context of the preamble. And probably the most important part of that is to create a better life for all. And the values of dignity, equality, and freedom must be upheld. So Section 25 must be read within the context of the preamble and within the context of the rights to dignity, equality, and freedom. There is scope within Section 25 to allow for expropriation. There are limitations, however, and we need to discuss those and see if they are reasonable limitations or not. Basically, the state should not be arbitrary in its approach to land reform. And not being arbitrary means also taking into account the needs of women when we look at the distribution of land in South Africa. Apartheid laws were discriminatory and arbitrary, and we certainly do not want laws in our country to be discriminatory and arbitrary. So in whatever we do, we need to ensure that there is no unfair discrimination and that we do not act in an unreasonable or arbitrary manner. So there are some issues around land that have been written about extensively, also by women. The role of mining corporations is a problem, something that has been happening over centuries, if not decades, with mining corporations taking over large tracts of land. And we can see resistance from rural communities around this. It's not only an environmental issue, it is also an issue of land and the ownership of land and the enjoyment of the fruits of the land. And the corporate social responsibility around issues of mines and these huge multinational mining corporations needs to be dealt with. And as I say, it's not only an environmental issue. Another issue, slightly more controversial, is the role of traditional leaders and customary law in the issue of ownership, women's ownership of land. And I suppose we have to face the fact that we live in a patriarchal society for a number of reasons, and all women, I think, do suffer under patriarchy. But we have to take into account many things. This is a complex issue. Many things when we talk about the role of women in society. And I have quite strong feelings about this, but I'm not going to impose them on anybody right now. I just want to look at 7 questions. Professor Ruth Hall, unfortunately, from UWC, couldn't join us, but she's asked 7 pertinent questions about land. And these questions apply to perhaps what we can discuss today, And I want you to think about these questions in the context of gender and women as well. Land reform for whom is the first question. So, number one, land reform for whom? Who is going to benefit from land reform? What is the agenda? What does the political economy look like? What are the questions of labor that we need to consider? So land for whom? Number two, land for what? Okay. So, what is land reform for? And what would the outcomes look like? The third question, where? Where is the land that we need to look at in terms of redistributive justice? Question 4, how are these decisions going to be made? Now, we have systems of governance in South Africa, and we know that the Portfolio Committee has been traveling all over South Africa gathering evidence from hearings. And there have been many, many people involved in these hearings, and there have been media reports about these hearings. But it's important for us to think about who ultimately will be making these decisions, but perhaps not who, because we do know, that Parliament will be looking at the legislation, the executive will be implementing policy, but perhaps who and then how will this happen? So that is the fifth question. How are we going to do this? And how are people going to get the land that they need? How are women going to get the land that they need? If there are certain patriarchal structures in place that prevent women from getting the land that they require. So there will be a lot of negotiations. There will have to be legal amendments, new laws in place to look at issues of ownership. But in fact, we also need to rethink what ownership is and what land tenure means. Because if we want to build a society of social cohesion and social solidarity, we can't look at this as individualistic issue. It's not an individual human right. It is something that should benefit society as a whole. The sixth question, some people think this is the most important one, but I think it's just one of the questions that we need to ask, is whether or not to compensate. So this is the very hot debate that's happening at the moment, and one that has been generally dominated by men. So who are we going to take the land from, and are we going to compensate or not? Now, there are some issues around this. For example, mining corporations. How do we deal with situations like that when we could face high levels of unemployment in the rural areas? And commercial land has been transacted since 1994. So there are questions about whether the land will be looked at as useful and therefore needed by the state, or whether there are other reasons for the expropriation to take place. What about people living in informal settlements, communal areas, farms? What kind of legal framework will we have? And with what kind of tenure will we work? One of the issues is that people can get tenure. One of the recommendations by the high-level panel.
Well, coming out of those proceedings, those are live visuals of the seminar on landless women of South Africa that is organized by the Human Sciences Research Council. We are expecting the Minister and the Women of Presidency, Bathabile Dlamini, to deliver the keynote address a bit later on. We do know that the seminar seeks to add women's voices in the debate on land expropriation without compensation, which has become an increasingly hot topic in the country. Stay tuned to AfriWorld View for the latest details with regards to that seminar. But for now, the Justice, Police and Health departments have gathered to address the corruption allegations levelled against the State Attorney's Office. Let's now cross back live to those proceedings yet again.
Of this kind in all three spheres of government, where abuse is uncovered as a result of collusion, either within government or between government and the private sector. So it is not, just to clarify that point further, limited to investigating abuses within the public sector. It is entitled to go into the private sector where the state has incurred loss as a result of the actions even of private actors.
Thank you, Ministers. I just want to augment on the timeline issue that came up. And I want to emphasize this to you members and to the public, that even before we issue the interim report to the President, it's important to note that where during the investigation we discover that there is a civil recovery that we need to make to recover what's due to the state, we action that there and there. In terms of, as the Minister alluded, in terms of the SIU legislation, SIU has got the powers and the authority to litigate in its own name on behalf of the state institutions, and we action that there and there. We'll obviously include it as part of the interim report that this action has been taken. Where there's evidence of criminality, we also put together the evidentiary material. We refer that for prosecution, and that's where, as the Minister of Police has indicated, that we work closely with the Hawks and we participate. If there's a need for our members to act as witnesses, we ensure that that is taking place. That also does not wait until we issue the interim report, simply because we are agreed that the quicker we take action against the perpetrators, the better. The Minister of Justice has added that as one of the outcomes is that if there is an indication that any member of the state institution or state attorney in this case is guilty of misconduct, we again put together the evidentiary material, we refer it to the accounting authority so that disciplinary action can be taken without delay. But there's also important that depending on the profession that we're dealing with, here we're dealing with lawyers, we're dealing with attorneys, and the Minister of Health has added that this may also impact on the medical practitioners. So in the process, depending on where the guilt points, we do then refer the members of those professions to their respective regulatory bodies. For state attorney or for the attorneys in general, we'll refer them to the Law Society, and we ensure that we follow up that process. If we are of the view that the person has to be removed from the role of attorneys, we do recommend and we ensure that we present that to the Law Society. We will do that with other various professions, including the doctors. And in the process, if there's a need to improve on the systems of the state attorney or any of the state institutions involved, we do then what we call systemic recommendation. This is nothing more than making recommendations for improvements in the business process. If the business process was defective, how is it that we want to ensure that there's checks and balances in future so that we avoid the irregular settlements that have come forth. So we will have to, as we do the investigation, ensure that we also recommend process improvements. Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate. We are 7 minutes away from the end of this briefing. So I will allow the two hands that I can see But let me start with, there's a third hand. Let me start with two hands that have not, people who have not asked questions, and I will end with you. Very briefly, please, one question each.
Good morning, Ministers. It's Alex from News 24. My colleague did ask if you'd please maybe just go into a bit more detail about the modus operandi that's being used in this collusion. I don't know if that was answered sufficiently. If you can just give us an idea, are they just settling winnable cases? Are they actually throwing these cases? Are they just deliberately lapsing deadlines? How is it exactly that they're, as Minister Motsoaledi said, that this cartel is operating? Thank you.
There's a gentleman who had his hand up.
Good afternoon, Aldrin Simpier from ENCA. On the proclamation at, I think it's number 6, if I'm not mistaken, there is intentional or negligent loss of public money or damage to public property. Can you just explain exactly what this means? What is the basis of this investigation? And Mokoni, if you'd allow me to please ask a second question. Minister Masutha, can you please tell us how far is the department and the presidency in terms of the appointment of the acting NDPP?
Yes.
Ministers, it's Barry Bateman again from Eyewitness News. Minister Masutha, I refer to the terms of reference in the proclamation. The one relates to the unlawful appropriation or expenditure of public funds, and then my colleague referred to the intentional or negligent loss of public money. Now, I referred to the Constitutional Court finding yesterday that the agreement with Mxolisi Nkosana was an abuse of power. Now, Mr. Nkosana has fingered you as well as being party to that particular agreement. Given the terms of reference here, will your role in that particular agreement form part of the investigation? And further, from setting an example for the officials in the department, should you remain on in your position considering you have been found to be party to an abuse of power which resulted in the loss of funds, public money? Thank you.
Should I assume that Cape Town does not have a question?
That's correct. No questions from Cape Town.
Thank you very much. I trust Cape Town.
Are we done? All right. No. On the issue of damage to property, maybe the Sayuhead can elaborate on that, under what circumstances. The nature of the abuses are also amplified in my statement, which I read out, citing examples you've just yourself cited. Obviously, plummeting the state's case deliberately in order to achieve a particular outcome that is adverse, both financially and otherwise, to the state, if that's done deliberately, is one of the things to be probed, because indeed there has been concerns that some of these incidents are just completely inexplicable. Yes, there would be various forms of abuse that would be hopefully uncovered. Let me just indicate that the role of a cabinet member responsible for the administration of justice is to do exactly that, is to ensure that all administrative processes relating to the running of the justice system, either that requires the executive, as in at the level of a minister, to perform, that those are undertaken by that cabinet member. But over and above that, any presidential act that relates to the administration of justice, which the President performs, whether in terms of the Constitution or a law. The administration thereof is performed, or the administrative support thereto is provided by the Minister of Justice. So when the former president, in his wisdom, embarked on a process in which he assigned particular people to perform certain duties on his behalf, that resulted in an agreement entered into effectively between the head of state and the former National Director of Prosecution. Our role was one of administrative support to actualize that. And I think that's the reason you would find that not much turns on our specific involvement in that matter. So, because otherwise, if a Minister of Justice simply refused to provide administrative support in the discharge of the executive responsibilities of a head of state in relation to administration of justice, then you'd effectively be impeding that head of state's ability to perform their duties. So it is a decision that was entered into, or agreement that was entered into effectively between the head of state and the erstwhile NDPP, and whoever was involved in negotiating that agreement. I wasn't party to those negotiations at all. I wasn't privy even as to how those calculations were arrived at. Mine was to provide the administrative support to ensure that that is actually executed. I hope that clarifies the matter. But if you, in your wisdom, feel that I'm not fit to hold this office, I suppose you might want to whisper a word to my boss, and if he agrees with you, it takes just a few minutes for that to be effected. But all I can say is that mine is just to perform my job to the best of my ability, and if others feel that I'm not doing a good job, they're perfectly entitled to be critical of me, and I take no qualms with that. Thank you.
The acting NDPP minister.
I will not preempt the President's office in making announcements in that regard. As you are aware, the law does indicate that the President consults with us in respect of certain decisions in this regard. So we would be privy of certain developments, but it would be inappropriate for me to preempt an official statement from the presidency unless I am given the task to communicate on behalf of that office, at which point I'd be more than happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, ministers and program director. The question I think that's outstanding at the moment that the minister indicated that I would comment on or respond to was the one relating to intentional or negligent loss of public money or damage to public property as it is contained in the proclamation. Very often, frequently it happens that as we investigate, we do make findings that the state has lost money based on the negligence of a particular official. In this instance, you would then investigate what the process followed to make the decision should be, that should have been followed. If it has not been followed, you then investigate why. More often, we find that there has been a human error, and the human error based on the negligence that the process was not followed. In that event, then it is obligatory on us to return the finding that there has been a negligence on the part of a particular official and that the money has been lost as a result of that. In this instance, if I were to use an example, if a matter has been referred to a state attorney and the matter is then subject to a court process and there has been a settlement and the matter was not subjected to formal litigation, we would then investigate the circumstances in which it was settled, and then there would be indicators of whether the matter was settled regularly or irregularly. And as part of that, we would then have to investigate whether there's been a negligence on the part of anybody. And if that is so, we are then obligated to return that finding. Once we return that finding and we are satisfied that there is negligence and the loss of money, we then kickstart the civil process to recover what would have been lost to the state. With regard to the possible damage to public property, you would know that by definition property would probably indicate to movable or not, or immovable. It's very infrequent that we find that there would have been damage to immovable property, but it's not uncommon that we find that there would have been destruction of movable property, for example, equipments that belong to the state. So in this event, there could be various numbers of equipments that we would use. We could have used possibly as exhibits to then prove our case, and we find that they have been damaged. And in that case, we do then make the appropriate finding that the state's property has been damaged. But in an unlikely event that an immovable property has been damaged, we will also make that finding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this briefing. And we hope to see you next time. And good afternoon. Good morning, Cape Town.
Good morning.